When you dare to share, you break the silence. When you dare to share, you speak your truth. When you dare to share, you use the full strength of your voice. When you dare to share, it brings opportunity to own your story. So tell it, be heard, and at the same time, your sharing is someone else's learning, inspiration, motivation, empowerment, and hope. There's always an element to each of our stories that remains a secret. For some, we feel it's a dirty little secret. Dare to share your untold story exposes these secrets in a welcoming and positive way. When we think mental health, more often than not, in our minds, these words are directly linked to illness, mental illness, and planted with a negative connotation. While physical health, more often than not, is processed with much more neutrality. Through sharing, storytelling, and raw conversation, together we can inspire across communities the notion of embracing an alternative, which I have reframed as mental beauty. The next way to see mental health. Take in the beauty, lessons, learnings, and owning that it is as much part of each of our lives as every other aspect of health and wellness. I encourage each of you out there to dare yourself to share what is yours to tell. When we dare, it is the courage to do something really important. Let this be a vow to each and every single one of us that we take risk, we brave, confront, and face what is, while inspiring and empowering all communities. So let's break that silence and tap into mental beauty. This is Salima Jadavji, your podcast host, a practicing clinical social worker, and your mental wellness connoisseur. Welcome to the Dare to Share Your Untold Story podcast, episode number 3, a teen's mental health voyage into the midst of anxiety. To all my fellow listeners, before we get started, I'm just dropping in a note to give you a heads up that this podcast might be emotionally triggering for you. We do invite guests onto the show who share openly about extremely difficult life moments with exposure and impact of what the struggles have been like. The intensity of each episode could have a variable impact on your emotional and mental well-being based on your own personal story. If at any point the topic becomes uncomfortable or upsetting to you in any way, please do not pressure yourself to listen. Instead, be kind to yourself, do some self-care, and perhaps give another episode a try. It is with pleasure I introduce to you our guest, Khayali. She is a grade 12 student at Mulgrave School in West Vancouver, BC. Referred by her family as an overachiever, when Khayali is not in school or studying, she can be found running her own business, Mix Munch and Lunch, volunteering for various service initiatives or in the theater backstage. Despite her friendly and outgoing demeanor, she understands what it is like to struggle with the invisible battles and hopes to use her story to change the perception of mental illness. She recently presented a TED-Ed talk on the subject and hopes to continue raising awareness on mental health. Well, hello there, Khayali. Welcome to the Dare to Share Your Untold Story podcast. I really want to extend my gratitude for you coming on here, fitting your academic schedule and the time zone differences, and for just showing your support for taking a stance to help break down barriers of mental stigma.
Thank you for letting me share my story.
This is my pleasure. I am so excited for what is about to unfold in our conversation today. So, as you know, this podcast is about bringing forward untold stories that people go through, whether directly about a mental health struggle or something else. And we know that no matter the story, there is impact on one's own mental health in some way which remains tucked away. And this platform serves in a way to break the barriers of mental stigma that have been conditioned in our society. So we're here really encouraging people to share and tell what individuals typically have reluctance for revealing. So, Khayali, I'm warmed up and ready to have this conversation. What about you?
Always ready.
All right, then shall we? Let's do this.
Sounds good.
Great. Okay, so give us the newspaper headline of how you would title your untold story. How would it read?
I think I would title it Teenage Girl Thrives in the Face of Mental Illness.
Wow, that title is so clear. And I don't even need to ask you what that means because it's so, so clear. And so I guess we just get right into your untold story. So tell us, what is your untold story all about?
Yeah, so pretty much I've struggled with anxiety since I was younger. Since I was little, it's just kind of always been a huge part of my life and something that I've struggled with growing up. So when I was younger, it manifested itself in smaller ways. It was more social anxiety situations. I got nervous going to school. School projects and presentations made me more nervous than it did for my peers. And I started seeing a therapist when I was younger to kind of learn how to manage my anxiety, especially in a young child. It can be quite a burden. And so it was something that I had to learn how to cope with. I learned how to manage myself, and the anxiety slowly subsided as I got older. And then in the past year, I would say my anxiety started coming back, and it was kind of something that's always in the back of my mind, but it reached an all new level of high, and it manifested itself in my life in such a different way than it ever had before. And in that process, I started to recognize the signs of depression in myself.
Mm-hmm.
I struggled a lot with going to school. I missed a lot of school because for me, the social aspect of school was quite difficult, but also some days I just couldn't manage the will to get out of bed. So that was something that I struggled a lot with. And then I also struggled a lot with eating. When I first went through my depressive episode, I stopped eating and I lost about 30 pounds in a month.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that process, my body wasn't getting the nutrients I needed. I was struggling with self-esteem issues. I was struggling with my depression, and my anxiety was just building. And then in November of 2019, I ended up going to a clinical psychiatrist. I was referred by my doctor, because I knew
Mm-hmm.
there was something wrong and I just couldn't figure out
Mm-hmm.
what it was. And it wasn't something related to my physical
Right.
health. I had blood tests. I had my health checked by a physician.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was referred to a psychiatrist, and I ended up being diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety, panic attacks, and clinical depression.
Right.
So for me, that was quite a difficult diagnosis, but it also made a lot of things make sense. For years, I'd been having panic attacks and not realizing that they were panic attacks. And so I was finally able to put my finger on what I was going through. And then I ended up starting medication. I took antidepressants to start dealing with the chemicals that weren't functioning properly in my brain.
Mm-hmm.
And I started talking to a therapist again. I actually went through two different therapists trying to find the one that worked best for me. And it was a process. It was definitely a struggle. I was dealing with the rigors of the IB curriculum at my school, while
Mm-hmm.
also struggling with depression and anxiety, and something that made me different than other people, and I didn't know how to deal with it, and I just was confused, and I felt like I was dealing with things wrong. And then it was hard for me because as soon as I started with my treatment and I started taking meds and I started going to therapy, I didn't notice the immediate changes that I wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And if I can ask for a quick second
oh
here,
yeah, of course.
you know, you said that you went to two therapists
Hmm.
before you found your right fit.
Yeah,
So, what made it be a right fit for you?
for me specifically, therapy has always been the kind of thing that I dread. Like, um, I just I know it's an experience that a lot of people have just because in therapy, it's where you uncover all the deep, dark things that you like
Mm-hmm.
to ignore and you don't really want to talk about. And for me, who's not the kind of person who talks about my feelings very often, that was really hard for me. And the first therapist that I talked to, she was quite helpful. I just wasn't comfortable enough to share all parts of me. And then I realized after a few months that it just wasn't working for me. The style of therapy that we were doing wasn't working. I just wasn't comfortable enough. It just wasn't the right fit for me. And so I ended up looking and doing some research, and I started talking to a different therapist who had actually experienced mental illness herself. So this is a therapist who has a direct experience with depression, and so she was able to relate to me a lot more. And I tended to connect with the way that she approached therapy differently. She focused on more the spiritual aspect of therapy and mental health as opposed to the physical and directly mental aspect. But that was helpful for me, and I realized that that was the right fit. And so I started going to her regularly. And I noticed that before my mental health got better, it started to get worse. I found it really difficult to go to school. I found it really difficult to function. I started struggling a lot with self-harm. Again, my eating was the first thing to go. I stopped working out regularly. My sleep schedule got messed up. I just wasn't feeling great. And it was a really hard time for me. And then as I saw my therapist regularly and continued to take my medication, I eventually started to feel a bit better again. And it was hard for me because I didn't really know anyone who I felt like I was feeling the wrong way. I felt like I wasn't feeling how I was supposed to feel. I
Mm-hmm.
felt like I was alone. I couldn't stop thinking, why me? Why do I have to feel like this? And it was a really difficult time for me because I feel like, in a way, I almost stigmatized myself. And eventually, I got to the place where I was so far in it that I had no choice but to come to terms with it.
Mm-hmm.
And in doing so, I learned to accept that part of myself.
Right.
And yeah, that was really important to me.
For sure, it's very important. And I mean, no one's mental health issue or struggle is easy, no matter what phase of their life that you're in. Because
Hmm.
when you're in it, when you're in the thick of it, you can't see clearly, right? So think about when you're recently there was a day I woke up and there was lots of fog and you really couldn't see much in front of me when I was driving, right? So when you're in the thick
Hmm.
of it, you really can't see, but maybe someone from like the helicopter could see a lot more things, right? So
Yeah.
depending on the angle, it's a lot. And so now, if being the teenager, right? Like you're still
Hmm.
developing, there's still a lot of stuff that you haven't been exposed to or privy to. So, I can only imagine how overwhelming that was for you to manage and figure out. And even though it seems like you had some sort of internal compass and navigation system that at least kept you to do more than just survive, it sounds like you didn't give up on yourself. You might have stigmatized yourself, but it doesn't sound like you gave up on yourself.
Hmm. Yeah, that was definitely something that I struggled with because I think when I first started going through my depressive episode, I was like, there's nothing I can do. I'm just going to sink into it and it'll be fine. But I was lucky enough that I had a strong support system. I had people who
Mm-hmm.
kind of urged me to watch out for myself and to
Right.
value myself, and that was something that was really important to me. And I have a mom who went through a depression similar to myself, and
Mm-hmm.
I have friends who are very understanding, and they always made sure that I valued myself and that I didn't give up on myself because they didn't give up on me, and I knew I couldn't do that to
Right.
them. So yeah, that was probably the biggest reason why I kind of stuck through it.
Yeah, that's really a beautiful synchronicity, right? So people didn't give up on you and you recognized
Mhm.
it. And so even if there were days sometimes you weren't fighting for you and you were fighting for them, part of you is still fighting for you, right? So it's
Mhm.
intertwined, but it was a cycle that everyone that was a part of it seemed to know their role and
Mhm.
you each committed to that role. And then you've been able to sort of get through the thickest parts, right?
Mhm.
That's what it sounds like. And so it does sound like there's a bigger backstory to what has made this mental health experience so much more prominent for you when you talk about your mom. I mean, certainly your mom being supportive, but
Mhm.
also what her struggles have been, as well as how she found a way to coach you and support you in that. That's really great.
Mhm.
So, is there anything else that you'd like to share in terms of how this journey has impacted you, having gone through all of what you have up to this point?
I think there's so many different ways that it's impacted me because
Mm-hmm.
it's a part of my life. It's a part of who I am, and it's something that I
Mm-hmm.
go through every day. But I think the biggest thing for me is that it's made me realize what's important to me, and it's made me realize that I'm in a position where I have access to resources, I have access to a support system, I have access to opportunities, and I want to use that access to become a voice for other people going through the same things that I'm going through, because in the thick of it, when I was going through it, I didn't have someone telling me that what I was feeling was okay, and they had gone through it too, and I wasn't broken, I didn't need to be fixed, and that was just where I was in the moment, and to be okay with that. And so I decided to start advocating for mental health. And I think that that's the most powerful part of my story, is that my story doesn't exist by itself. It exists in the ways that it's been able to influence other people.
So you have become a game-changing agent yourself along this process. That's fantastic. That's really great. And so, one of the questions that we ask in this podcast is what part of the journey that you are in. So for yourself, where would you say you're at? Would you say that you're looking back, in the middle, or just getting started?
I think I'm just getting started. I'm still in the middle. I'm 17. I'm going through high school. I'm still in high school. Like, I haven't even graduated yet. I'm still, let alone growing into my mental health, I'm growing into myself. I'm still developing my identity. I'm still realizing what's important to me. I'm still discovering what I want to do, who I want to be. And in that process, I'm learning how to become who I want to be as someone who experiences mental illness. And that's such a huge part of me that I've only just started being able to experiment with and learn about. So I really do think I am, if not in the middle, still at the beginning. This is a learning process, and I'm still young, and it's something that's new to me.
Okay. And so what do you want to remember about the process of your healing journey in terms of what you've experienced so far?
I think the biggest thing that I want to remember is that even though it feels like the end of the world when you're in it, it does get better. And for me, I think I had this moment of realization when I got out of my first depressive episode, and I looked at the world and I was like, oh, I genuinely forgot what it felt like to be happy. And it was such a weird feeling for me, because I thought that I was happy, and I thought that I was functioning normally, and I thought that that was just the way that the world was. And then I got out of the fog, as you mentioned, and I could see everything clearly, and I felt happy. And I had people coming up to me and being like, oh, Khayali, like, you look so happy today, or you look different, like you have this glow, like what's going on? Something changed.
Right.
And it was this moment where I was like, me, when I'm in my depressive episode, isn't the real me. And it's when you're in it, it's really hard to see past it. But it was that moment where I realized that it does get better always. Even if it doesn't feel like it's going to, it will.
Right.
And that's just that feeling of, this is what pure happiness feels like, is what's going to motivate me for the rest of my life.
And it really sounds like what you're telling us is that you don't necessarily outgrow the mental illness, you grow into it. And it seems like you've grown into it in terms of where you've come to be up to this point in your life. I can hear it in your voice as you express and articulate the way you do, that you're embracing what is showing up, and you're accepting all these different parts that are part and parcel of going through mental illness, and normalizing it for yourself, saying, this is just another part. And it's like also like building a new muscle, right? So it's like, these are all parts of my body. These are all parts of me. And, some parts are really strong and active, and this one is acting up. And I need to figure out the means to build that muscle to get it strong so that I can continue to rise and thrive every day.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest thing that I've learned, is that I've learned to embrace the good and the bad of my mental illness. And I think that the biggest problem is, yes, mental illness is stigmatized as a society, but it's also, it's stigmatized to the point where we're told that we need to move past it. We're told that we need to go to therapy, take meds, and get better. We're told that it's just a small roadblock in our life and we just have to get through it.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, what I've learned is that it is my mental illness that makes me who I am. And it's with all the bad comes just as equal in value good.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, that was kind of something that I had this moment of realization. And it's something that no one really talks about because we always see mental illness as a bad thing. And for the first time in my life, it was hard, but it wasn't a necessarily bad thing. It was hard in the same way that working out is hard, but you feel better and it's good for your body.
Yes,
It's this
exactly.
Yeah, so it was the
Right.
same thing for me, and I knew that I needed to share that with other people, which is why I ended up presenting a TED talk.
Right. So this is the part that gets tucked away, right? And so much of that society conditioning that we were talking about at the start, right? So I really admire, I truly admire your ability to hold on to hope, the way you embrace what comes when it comes, and that you're so very present focused. And that you can also embrace and claim it with confidence. And when you say things like, it appears, the way you've described everything, that you're basically saying, like, I love myself and who I am, and I'm accepting all parts of myself. And you accepting all parts of yourself is such a game-changing attitude and mindset to adopt. And it's just so inspiring. And I hope that there's some listeners out there who can also, share or resonate with where you're going with this. So even if they're not there yet, that perhaps this could inspire them or motivate them to see things in this way as well.
I hope so.
Mm-hmm. And so what would you say that you are grateful for with encountering this mental illness journey, like this mental health journey, with the anxiety and the depression?
There's two things that I'm grateful for. The first one is it's increased my capacity for empathy. And the second is it's allowed me to connect with people in my life. So I'm going to start by talking about the empathy because I think for me that was the big game changer. So since I was really young, I've always been a really empathetic person. That's just a huge part of who I am. I've always been the social activist warrior, fighting for people who don't have a voice. It's always been a huge part of who I am. And then as I started struggling with depression, I realized that I was able to feel emotions so incredibly strongly. And in part that goes because yes, I was able to feel the sadness and despair and the depression very intensely, but also we feel emotions in opposites. And so I was able to feel happiness 10 times as strongly as anybody else. And in doing so, I was able to empathize with people more because I knew what it felt like to be in certain situations. And moving forwards from there, I was always able to connect with people and I was able to be a shoulder for other people to lean on because I knew even if I hadn't been in the same situation as someone else, I knew what it felt like to be there. I was able to relate to the emotions, even if I wasn't able to relate to the situation. And that became almost my superpower because I was able to empathize with people on a way that was insane. And I had people coming up to me and being like, Khayali, you give the best advice. I feel like you're in my mind. And I'm like, yeah, it's my superpower. It's called depression.
Right. This inner knowing. It's like this inner knowing that you have. So it's like something you've built. It's now like part of your DNA. Right.
And people always talk about not being able to empathize. I have friends who are like, I can sympathize with you, but I can't empathize with you because they feel me, but they just can't understand what I'm going through because they've never experienced anything like it. But for me, I have this capacity for empathy because I felt every single thing imaginable because I feel things so strongly. I feel like it's the greatest thing that my depression ever could have given me. And that's why I could never resent my mental illness because it's given me a superpower. And that's pretty amazing.
It is pretty amazing. It's so amazing. And a moment ago you were talking about, even if you haven't gone through the same thing that someone else has, it's almost like you have this inner radar, right? Like it's in your DNA now. So you pick up on things and you show up for people. And, something that I have learned about people in my therapy room with the clients that I speak and talk to, one of the things that helps people the most is people don't necessarily need someone who has been there, but just, the idea of the willingness for someone to receive you. And so when clients tell me, like, they describe the experience of like when someone sat there and listened and there's just this unconditional, there wasn't someone expecting something in return, but a person really feeling, an individual really feeling received in that moment, that even if they don't know what I'm going through, they're willing to be here. And it sounds like people were connecting with how they were being received by you, with how you've described how you connect and show up for people.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
a really
So,
cool experience, and it's allowed me, I feel like it's almost what pulled me out of my major depressive episode, because even though I felt isolated in my head, I always knew that I was surrounded by people who I connected with, and that was important for me. And even though I didn't have, I mean, I had my mom, but I didn't have anyone my age who really understood what I was going through. I could be that person for other people. And
yeah.
sometimes that alone was enough to get me out of bed.
So I'm curious. I mean, you've shared a lot about how the anxiety and the depression, both of them, how they've impacted you and, what you've gone through and all the details that you shared, and so authentically that you did. I'm wondering if there's anything else in terms of your experience with anxiety and or depression, how it's influenced your overall mental well-being. I guess like the positives and maybe the not so positives, right? Like whether we're talking about the turmoil or whether we're talking about the resilience that comes from it. You've been able to talk about both very well. Is there anything else to either side of those spectrums that you feel you would like to say more about?
I think the biggest thing is that definitely from the negative side, it was super hard. And I don't want to sugarcoat it at all, because I don't want to feel like
Mm-hmm.
it's inauthentic, because it
Mm-hmm.
was hard. Like I couldn't get out of bed. I started sleeping in my parents' room because I couldn't even be alone. Like it's hard. And it affected all aspects of my life. It affected school, it affected friends. Again, I mentioned it affected my eating. And then a big thing for me was always the self-harm side of it. So it was a huge part of the way that I saw myself and the way that I saw the world around me. And that
Mm-hmm.
really negatively affected me for a while. But I think I want to draw that to the main positive conclusion that I got out of that. And it was that emotions are normal. Everyone's going to
Mm-hmm.
feel happy. Everyone's going to feel sad. Everyone's going to feel anxious. Everyone's going to feel stressed. Everyone's going to feel upset. It's just the way that the human brain functions. Emotions are what make us human. And because I felt these emotions at such extremes, I learned how to cope with those feelings. And so now when I'm going through normal stressors
Mm-hmm.
or normal moments in my life that can be upsetting, I've learned ways to manage and to cope with them. And I've learned skills that I'll be able to carry with me for the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the kind of thing that most people don't learn until they are stuck in the middle of it and they have to find a solution or they'll drown. And for me, it's something that I had to learn at a really young age, but I'm so grateful that I got to learn it, because I
Mm-hmm.
know it's going to make me so much more successful throughout the rest of my life, because it's something
Right.
that I already know how to do.
Yeah, you learned how to cope with high pressured situations,
Mhm.
all from dealing with what you went through on a mental health voyage. And everything you dealt with was so
Mhm.
powerful in every way possible, right? In terms of how you've described it. And I think you might have even said
Mhm.
powerful earlier in our conversation. The way that you mention, emotions are normal and it's
Mhm.
what makes us human. And the idea that you've been able to sort of experience all of that and then some, right?
Mhm. Definitely, and then some.
Yeah. And so you've really coped, you've really figured out a way. So it's like when we were talking about navigating with your inner radar, right? So your inner radar is even that
Mhm.
much more heightened and it's become sensitive. So it can detect things in a very different manner than a person who might not have gone through a mental health struggle like yourself. And so your ability to cope to be equipped to cope with
Mm-hmm.
high pressure situations is definitely something to honor and recognize that, yeah, that's something that's influence. Like that's a positive influence. That's something that I have gained from this.
Yeah, and again, like I think a big thing, like I mentioned earlier, we're so programmed as a society to feel these negative emotions and then be like, okay, this is a bad emotion. I'm gonna like become happy now, or I'm gonna become unstressed. And because I spent so long
Mm-hmm.
not being able to do that, like I couldn't physically be like, okay, Callie, like we're not gonna lie in bed all day today. We're gonna get out and be productive. I learned to be able to sit in some of these negative emotions. And I think that's something that not a lot of people know how to do. And it's such an important part of life because, like I said, like emotions, you're going to feel them.
Mm-hmm.
And I've learned how to sit in it instead of trying to move through it.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes because I didn't have a choice, but it's something that I think a lot of people fail to recognize and I think is super important. And I'm so grateful to have learned that.
One thing that I talk about all the time in the therapy room and in all other conversations, it kind of softens the blow for calling emotions negative or positive. But I talk about things being comfortably
Mm-hmm.
uncomfortable. Right? So
Mm-hmm.
it sounds like you were sitting with
Yeah.
the discomfort, right? So I talk about this before. Sometimes
Mm-hmm.
I talk about this in the therapy room. So it's this idea of when you're doing a yoga pose, when you're doing a stretch, if you're doing yoga and you're doing more of the passive side and you're stretching, if you lean into a stretch with vigor, right? If you're just trying to stretch your hamstring or something of that sort, and you lean in real fast,
Mm-hmm.
your knee-jerk reaction is going to sort of bounce you out, right? So you'll lean
Mm-hmm.
in and then you might jump out because that pain, it's so much, right? It's like, oh, that was really painful. It's no longer a stretch. It's like you're inducing pain. And so if you ease up and then say, okay, where is it? Where can
Mm-hmm.
I feel? Where can I sit with this? Up to what place can I lean in where I feel the
Mm-hmm.
discomfort and it still be comfortable enough to breathe through it?
Mm-hmm.
And in these types of yoga classes, I know that they invite you into these poses. So I know that after a few minutes, you end up progressing in your stretch from where you started when the
Mm-hmm.
clock, dings or whatever. And so you automatically do progress, but it's an invitation. And so I
Mm-hmm.
feel like when people force themselves to come out, right? So you don't need to be coming out, you're kind of cheating yourself. There's a process there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it sounds like what you're talking about also very much translates to this. And so I often encourage people to get comfortably uncomfortable and so that you ease in. And then when that gets comfortable and feels good, then you dig a little deeper. You dive in a little further. And then you keep going until you have been able to discover what you need to discover and own what you need to own. Does that resonate for you at all?
Yeah, 100%. It's a process.
Absolutely the process. Yes.
Yes.
That's great. So, what is your key message to listeners for the show? Like, I'm curious about two things. I'm curious, like, as a voice of teenagers, right? You're like a
Mm-hmm.
voice of teenagers, having gone through some of what you've gone through. What's your message to them? And then what about the parents of these teens? What's a key message to them? Can you offer some words of wisdom from Khayali?
I don't know how wise they'll be, but um, I would definitely say the biggest piece and the best piece of advice that I could ever give to another young person is to unapologetically be yourself. I think this occurs at all stages of life, but it's particularly prominent in the adolescent years as you're coming into yourself and dealing with a lot of social pressures, high school drama, all that kind of stuff. I think that we feel like we're expected to appear a certain
Mm-hmm,
way,
mm-hmm,
and so we try and fit into that mold of who we think that we are supposed to be. And in doing so, we prevent ourselves from flourishing and becoming everything that we are, and we prevent ourselves from embracing the ugly with the beautiful. And I
mm-hmm,
think that that's something that's really difficult to understand and to learn because we feel we very much want to fit into this mold, and we feel that if we are truly ourselves and we break away from that, then we're not going to be accepted or people are going to look at us differently. And I know that was definitely something that I struggled with because, again, I don't have a lot of peers who struggle with mental illness the same way that I do. So
mm-hmm,
when I first started going through all my mental health stuff, so like my depressive episode, I missed a lot of school, and a lot of people would come up to me and be like, Callie, why are you always missing school? Like, what's wrong with
mm-hmm.
you?
Right.
And I was like, oh, like no one's ever going to understand me because they just don't get it. And
Right.
then eventually I got to the point where I was like, I can't hide this part of me anymore because it is a part of me. And I felt like I was doing myself and my friends a disservice by hiding that. And so I started being more open. I started talking about my experience with mental health. And now it's very much, I bring it into conversations casually. It's like talking about my shoes. It's just another thing
Mm-hmm.
that I talk about. And for
Mm-hmm.
me, it was so scary to start talking about it. But ever since it's kind of become a part of my vernacular and my everyday life,
Mm-hmm.
so many people come up to me and they're like, Callie, like, how do you do this? Like, I can't believe you have like the courage to talk about this, or I'm so grateful that you can talk about this, or thank you for sharing. And it's that moment of realization where actually no one looked at me worse. If anything, they looked at me as someone stronger and they looked at me for everything that I was. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, there are people who are not going to appreciate every single part of you. That's life. There's a lot of people who aren't going to be able to understand. But at the
Right.
same time, there's a lot of people who are going to love every single part of you just a little bit more every time you open up and share something new. And it was something that I learned by going through it. And it was probably the most terrifying thing that I've ever experienced.
Right. Well, you were embracing all parts of yourself. And
Hmm.
because you were embracing all parts of yourself and really owning it and standing in it, other people also had the opportunity to embrace all parts of you too. So I
Hmm.
often say, or I often believe that, when you want someone to show up in a certain way for you, you need to create the opportunity to give them that chance to show up in the way you'd like them to show up. And it sounds like you did exactly that when you took that courageous step and started to speak out loud.
Yeah, and I think like a really good tangible example of that for me was I mentioned earlier that I struggle a lot with panic attacks.
Mm-hmm.
And I think panic attacks are quite stigmatized,
Mm-hmm.
especially because they're very difficult to understand because it's mental health related, but it has physical health symptoms, which tends to really confuse people.
Yeah, all the physiological symptoms that onset
Hmm.
from a panic attack. Yes.
So it was something that I didn't really feel comfortable sharing with people, but it was something that I experienced a lot. And it got to the point where I was hanging out with all my friends and I started feeling the symptoms of a panic attack. And I ended up going into this major panic attack. And it was the point where I couldn't hide it because I was sitting there and I wasn't able to breathe and my mind was racing. And it was just so many things happening at all at the same time. And I felt like I was going to
Mm-hmm.
die. And I was sitting there, and in that moment, I showed my friends and the people around me what I needed, and they were able to show up for me.
Right.
And that was something that I never really had the courage to do until I was forced to. But it was also the shortest panic attack of my entire life.
Mm-hmm.
And I also felt the best coming out of it because I had that support and I felt understood because I shared that part of myself and I let other people show up for me.
It's a beautiful way to experience a panic attack.
I mean, that might be sugarcoating it a little, but
But I get what you're trying to say, right? That you're
Mhm.
trying to paint the picture that once you took that risk to be truly
Mhm.
authentic to who you are, all parts of you, vulnerable and
Mhm.
all, right? You took
Mhm.
that risk and you saw immediately the benefit from it.
Mhm.
And so, panic attack or not, it was being experienced differently. You were being received differently. You were being supported differently because people knew they could support you now. Hiding it from the world and having to face it alone is different than when you're taking an army with you. Like, it's
Yeah.
still going to be war, right? But it's
Mhm.
like you're equipped with an army this time. You've got your armor, you've got your shields,
Mhm.
and you've got the people backing you up,
Mhm.
right? That's what it sounds like. So, do you have like a quick message, like to parents who have teens who might be struggling with a mental health situation? Like, do you have a message for parents?
I think I have two main things. The first
Okay.
would be to be authentic and to be there and honest. I think the biggest thing, especially for me, that I struggled with is that I felt like no one understood me. And so when I started talking to my mom, who also struggles with mental illness, and she was able to share anecdotes of what she went through and how I wasn't alone and this was something that she experienced too, I felt less alone.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, that's specific to having a family member who struggles with depression, but it's also, again, as I was mentioning, throughout your life, you're going to go through certain stressors and feel certain emotions. And so I think parents have a higher capacity for empathy than young people specifically, just because they've
Right.
experienced more things in their life. And so they're
Right.
able to relate to those emotions better. And I think that being completely honest with your child and sharing what it feels like to be in those horrible emotions and to be
Mm-hmm.
okay with the fact that sometimes it sucks is so important to, especially for youth who are dealing with the stigmas of mental health.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second thing that I would say is to just show up and be there and listen to your kid. Even if you're not like my parents and you're not like my mom and you can't understand what your kid is going through from personal
Mm-hmm.
experience, being
Mm-hmm.
there and listening to your kid is enough.
Right.
The idea of knowing that there's someone who loves you and supports you unconditionally
Mm-hmm.
is so powerful. And I think we underestimate that. And I think that in that situation, that's what's most valuable to get from a parent.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important that parents know that that's enough. It's enough to just sit there and love your child and listen to them and be okay with the fact that they're struggling. It's hard, but it's their journey.
Right. So not so much the fixing, but just the being there, the
Yeah.
supporting, and that I really appreciate that you coined it unconditional love, because I think that's true for so many
Mhm.
situations, but especially when you're a teenager, those are tender years, right? Those are really lots of hormones. There's a lot of different
Mhm.
things you're experiencing. There's lots of pressures, as you've already highlighted, and a lot of different things that you're going through. And I remember being in high school and
Mhm.
how complicated things would get. And I know that for teens now, it's even that much more. It's always like that for a different generation. There's
Mhm.
always that much more pressure, and the pressures change. So
Mhm.
it's not so much about having someone understand the pressure, it's just being there.
Yeah.
Or maybe understand the pressure as a bonus, but it's not necessarily that you need them to fix the pressure. You just need them to be there to guide you so that you can sort of cultivate that inner radar and learn to navigate for yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that a big thing is, obviously I'm not a parent, so I wouldn't know,
Mm-hmm.
but I think a big thing is we have this innate human tendency to fix people.
Yes,
And
yes, we do. It
I don't,
happens.
yeah, like it's human nature. And I find myself
Mm-hmm.
wanting to fix other people, and it's normal, but I don't want to be fixed. I want someone to sit there and listen to me. I don't want advice. I don't want someone to tell me
Mm-hmm.
how to live my life. I just want to know that at the end of the day, I'm supported. And I think that that's
Mm-hmm.
something that a lot of the times we forget because we get so wrapped up in trying to take away someone else's pain that
Yep.
we don't let them sit through it
Yeah.
and don't help them. We focus on trying to take away the pain instead of teaching people how to cope with the pain.
Well, this goes back to the discomfort, right? So
Mhm.
when a person is uncomfortable with the situation, they want to fix it,
Yeah.
right? So then we're talking about each individual person's experience. And this is where
Mhm.
it's like, okay, so you're uncomfortable with my situation, so you want to alter it. But it's not
Mhm.
about them, it's about you and what you
Mhm.
need and what's
Yeah.
important for you.
Exactly.
Hmm. So I'm really curious, what is your game changer inspiration that's close to you? Something that reflects your untold story. So is there like an inspirational book or quote or a person or something that speaks to you? What would that be?
So I think the big thing for me is I mentioned earlier that I've always been the social justice warrior type person.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a huge part of my identity. I am a huge bookworm. So I grew up reading all these books. Like I read The Color Purple in like grade 6. I read The Alice Network.
Wow.
It's such a huge part of my identity. And in doing so, I was exposed to so many different ideas. And I just had this desire to help the world. there's so many problems right now in the world, and I
Mm-hmm.
knew even from a young age that my purpose in life was to make someone else's life easier. And then when I got older, I ended up doing a
Mm-hmm.
research project on Malala Yousafzai. And she is such an incredible role model. She's
Mm-hmm.
done so much to fight for female education in the face of so many external pressures and so much. She's had her life threatened, and throughout all this she's
Mm-hmm.
still pursuing her education,
Mm-hmm.
and fighting for the rights of women all across the world. And it was this moment where I was like, you know what, if
Mm-hmm.
Malala can get shot in the head and still fight for women's rights, then I can be depressed and still do
Mm-hmm.
what I know I was
Mm-hmm.
meant to do in this world. And
Right.
helping people is so important to me in the sense that, yes, I just think it's important, but also
Mm-hmm.
it's how I help myself. And when I'm in a depressive episode, it's helping people that allows me to realize a purpose and allows me to realize something to look forwards to and allows me to find a place within this world that feels so isolating. And so
Mm-hmm.
that was a moment of realization where I was like, you know what? This is what I'm meant to do, and this is what I'm going to do. And from that moment on, that's kind of what everything was geared towards, whether it was advocating for mental health or local poverty,
Mm-hmm.
or whether it be pursuing higher education for the sake of being educated enough to have the opportunity to make a change and to know enough to make a change. That's kind
Mm-hmm.
of what my entire life revolved around. And that
Yeah.
was so important to my mental health because it was, in the end, what saved me.
Right. And it almost sounds full circle. Like you talk about
Hmm.
this idea of being an activist and how you know that one of the things that helps you is to help others, and that you, and knowing that such a big part of your life and purpose is to help others and that you thrive from that. But the
Hmm.
hidden part that you haven't said so outwardly that I've picked up on, and why I say it's full circle, is that you're engaging in a process called resourcing. And this resourcing idea, I learned it from someone by the name of Dr. Kristen Neff. She's like a self-compassion guru and researcher, and all things self-compassion, that's her jam. So she talks about this concept of resourcing, how really when you give to yourself and you're replenished and you have everything that you need, then you have more than enough, you have abundance, so you have more than enough to give out. And when you give out, there is an energy exchange that you receive back. And so
Hmm.
the cycle keeps going, and that's resourcing. But it's not resourcing if you completely
Hmm.
give everything that you have and spread yourself so thin, and then all you get is like you're depleted and dried up. That's not really sustainable, right?
Hmm.
So the thing I picked up on from you is that you really have learned what you need to do to take care of yourself so that you can then resource to do the thing that you were meant to do.
Yeah, and I think that was something that I struggled with a lot because I was like, I just want to help people. And
Yeah.
I got to the point where I had so many people who, once I came out about my story with mental health, I had a lot of people reach out to me expressing their own concerns with their mental health and asking for advice. And I wanted to be that person that people could lean on, and I wanted to be there for everybody and everyone. It got to the point where, like I said, I'm still in the middle of my mental health journey. And at that point, I was still in the middle of a depressive episode. And now I'm trying to deal with my mental health as well as other people's. And I got to the point where I kind of had to be like, you know what? I can't do this right now. And I'm doing myself and other people a disservice by spreading myself this thin.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned how to say no and do what was important for me while also, in the bigger picture, being that person. So that was like super important for me to learn.
Right. Absolutely. So, before we wrap up, tell me, what's a cause or an organization that has been impactful to you on your journey that you'd like to give a shout out to?
So I think the big thing, going on to the theme of helping others,
Mm-hmm.
I would say in 2016, I went to the downtown east side, which is an underprivileged sector of Vancouver, which is where I'm
Mm-hmm.
from, to hand out 100 lunches to the homeless. And in doing this, I was able to help my local community and I was able to interact with the people in my community. And it was this moment where I knew that this was something I needed to keep doing. And so I
Mm-hmm.
ended up making it a bi-monthly initiative. Now I go with other youth from Vancouver to hand out 100 lunches in the downtown east side of Vancouver. And originally it was sponsored through corporate sponsorship. So I reached out to local businesses, explained
Mm-hmm.
my cause, and asked if they could provide any financial support. And I was able to fund my initiative through that. And then in about 2018, I
Mm-hmm.
started my own social entrepreneurship business, Mix Munch and
Mm-hmm.
Lunch, where I sell
Mm-hmm.
customizable frozen cookie dough off of a website. And that
Mm-hmm.
was an opportunity for me to sponsor my initiative because I was able to put all my profits from my social entrepreneurship business into Lunch, my social initiative.
Mm-hmm.
And this was an opportunity for me to help myself
Mm-hmm.
because I was able to help other people. I had something that I was held accountable to. I had responsibilities that were important to me. So I had something that kept me going forward.
Mm-hmm.
I had something to feel good about because I knew that I was helping people and that was important to me. And I also felt like I had a purpose. And that was super important for me in the
Mm-hmm.
midst of my major depressive episode. And so I created the initiative that actually helped me the most, and that was something that
Wow.
was it was an incredible experience for me, and because I created it, I was able to give myself and my community what I needed, and that was an invaluable experience.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah, that like I don't have words. I'm in awe for everything that you've just like I was already in awe with your story and your resilience and in overcoming it and the influences that came along the way. And now hearing at a young age what you've already sort of cultivated, it is just beautiful. It
Thank
really
you.
is. And really admirable. And I'm sure, I mean, I can't really keep saying I'm sure. However, I'm certain that there are people out there who will also be inspired by exactly the initiative that you've created here. And I hope that you continue to get the support that you need so that you can keep giving back in the way that you do. Because it seems like you give back, you look forward, and you feel proud.
Mhm.
So, you know, your story might have hit home to a lot of teenagers or someone else.
Mhm.
So, if someone wanted to connect with you, how can they do that? If they want to connect with you personally, what would you be comfortable with in terms of someone reaching out to you?
Yeah, so I'm actually super accessible. The
Mm-hmm.
easiest way would probably to reach out to me via email. So my email address is khayalid@gmail.com, KHAYALID@gmail.com. I'm also accessible on Facebook. Again, it's just my name, so Khayali Dhanji. And then I'm also accessible. I'm on my Instagram account quite often. So if anyone wanted to reach out to me via Instagram DM, that's also totally an option. My username is life.with.kays, Kayz.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also accessible on LinkedIn. Again, it's just my name, Khayali Dhanji. Again, like I would love to hear from people. I'm super accessible and I would love to have people reach out to me. I think that would
Mm-hmm.
be so cool.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, your handles are very clearly articulated. We'll have them on the website for people to know as well.
Perfect.
So, Kayali, this was such an exhilarating conversation for me to have with you. I mean, as much as it was a difficult topic and a really raw topic to talk about, just like we said was going to be raw, I mean, it was still so exhilarating because I never knew what you were going to say and how you were going to say it and what was going to show up. There was just so much there. And so I thank you for sharing fully, without holding back and letting your voice lead the way from where it began all the way to where you are now. So I really thank you for being part of the Dare to Share Your Untold Story and helping to be a voice in breaking down the barriers of mental stigma.
Thank you for giving me the platform to do so.
It's been my honor and my pleasure. It certainly has. I feel so honored to have the opportunity to bring guests such as yourself onto the show to help spread what I'm trying to achieve here. And your story certainly hits home right there. And so I'm hopeful that, other people will feel more comfortable to come forward, own their story, submit their story, and claim their voice.
I hope so.
To all of our listeners, if you like what you've been hearing on this podcast and you want to be part of breaking down barriers of mental stigma, I invite you to go wherever you are listening to the episode and hit subscribe. Leave us a comment or a review of the episode and maybe how you relate to it. To learn more about what we offer, visit www.daretoheal.co. And if you are feeling ready and brave to share, please submit your story by visiting www.daretoshare.co. Thanks for joining in.